Fantastic. Well, as Natalie, I'll just kick straight in if that's okay, Natalie, and
Yeah,
just a few
please.
minutes behind. Yeah, no, absolutely. Really thrilled as part of the exec supporting for the special interest group for health economics alongside clinical trials, supported by the Australian Clinical Trial Alliance to be able to do the introduction for Jemima, who I get to know on a different lens and scape, and I think we're all very eagerly awaiting to see. Hear from Jemima. I won't do too much in way of presentation, except I think we're all here because discrete choice experiments have become an absolute stable methodology in terms of its ability to inform health policy as well as kind of preference elicitation for health states. I think with more consumer engagement in terms of health services, I think we're seeing discrete choice experiments being used there to kind of help co-design and deliver sort of services that meet patient expectations and sort of increase adherence and utilization. We're seeing it in public policy as well in terms of people's preferences more broader around how health and policy can be established. So I think we're seeing, increasing use and kind of breadth of discrete choice experiments within health economics, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation. If it's okay with Jemima, we might ask people to put their questions in the chat and have questions at the end for a good, robust Q&A. But without further ado, handing over to Jemima.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, team, for inviting me to present. I'm looking at the list of names that I can see, and there's lots of people I don't know, so I feel like this is a really nice chance to get to connect with you. I will try a little bit to connect what I'm going to be presenting more directly into economic evaluation, but it's mostly about discrete choice experiment stuff. So I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts at the end or in the discussion. Now I'm just going to find my presentation again. And hopefully I've done the trick and you can let me know that I'm sharing correctly or not.
Yep, that's great, Jemima. Thank you.
Terrific. So what I'm going to be talking mostly about is a reporting checklist that we developed for use in discrete choice experiments in health. But I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning about DCEs and DCEs connecting to economic evaluation, and then talk a bit about how we think the checklist can be used and useful for people in the field. So if anybody is interested, this is the paper that I'm going to be referring to. It was published late last year, and the checklist has kind of got out into the world and started to be used. But first, just to talk about DCEs for anybody who's less familiar with them. Usually in a DCE, there's a series of choice sets, and on the left here we have something that looks a bit like a choice set. So this is from a recent study of mine. In people, we'd usually see more than one of these. And it describes at the beginning a little hypothetical choice. So imagine that, in this case, it was imagine that you were looking to have a GP visit and these were the options you were presented with. Would you choose one of the visits or would you choose to go without it? Each of the alternatives, these are alternatives, is described in terms of attributes. These are the attributes. And then there's a response of a choice at the bottom. So DCEs are grounded in utility theory and have some advantages over other ways of eliciting preferences like Likert scales or other kinds of non-choice-based methods. We assume in doing a DCE that people have preferences for these, the attributes, and that it's not so much in-person overall, although we can attach some meaning to the label of an in-person visit versus a telehealth visit. But we think that these attributes are what causes somebody to think that this option is better for them than this option, or this option gives them greater utility. And as I said, the respondents choose in each choice set between alternatives over a series of choice sets. And this figure on the right here is just depicting the growth in DCEs in health. This is from PubMed over the last 25 years. So there's certainly been large growth over that time. And there's a number of different applications of DCEs in health. Probably the most common actually is in valuing health outcomes or outcomes of healthcare. But also very common is preferences for healthcare goods or services, and that's where a lot of my work fits. I would say preferences for health policy is also another application that comes under that heading. Job preferences of healthcare providers is something that's been used quite a bit, but I don't tend to see as much of it these days. So we can also use DCEs outside health, goods or services outside health, such as exercise and nutrition, or smoking cessation, or green space. They can be used for priority setting. They can use in some really interesting applications for processes of care. So not so much about valuing something for economic evaluation, but for instance, what's the acceptability of something like data usage? And can we feed that into the processes of deciding what's allowed to happen, and also preferences for health insurance. So in terms of thinking about how DCEs connect to economic evaluation, the big one is valuation of quality of life, or in sometimes valuation of other kinds of outcomes. And that might be used in a cost-benefit analysis framework more so than in a cost-effectiveness or cost-utility analysis framework. Something that I don't see as much of that as I would expect is their use in modelling. So you can use a DCE to predict uptake, or in fact, really interestingly, heterogeneity in uptake, and incorporate that into a model as part of a cost-effectiveness analysis. They've been used in a couple of countries only to try to inform the setting of thresholds for economic evaluation. And I just have this open question as to why there's not more of these kinds of things going on. I think particularly the prediction of uptake. In terms of their place in the Australian Health Technology Assessment Guidelines, there's certainly a mention of them in the PBAC guidelines about using DCEs to value non-health outcomes as part of a supplementary analysis. But I sit on the MSAC PICO advisory subcommittee, and I haven't seen their use in estimating uptake, for instance, even though there's lots of situations where I feel like they could be really useful to inform our decision making. So onto the checklist that I mentioned. So we developed, this was myself and my colleagues who were listed on the front page, developed a reporting checklist for DCEs. And I feel like I don't need to tell this group how common and useful reporting checklists are in other areas of health economics, like the CHEERS checklist. But in this field, there weren't really any checklists that related to reporting. There was one related to the qualitative methods used to define and develop attributes and levels for a discrete choice experiment, and one that was used, could be used, but not very commonly used for reporting online survey components. But there wasn't an overall reporting checklist, and whilst there was lots of guidelines on how to do a DCE, and that included some quality checklists, a reader can't really tell what someone's done unless a study is reported well enough to allow them to assess quality. And that had been picked up in a number of systematic reviews which were calling for better reporting quality. And so we thought this was a way that we could help to improve that. The aim of what we did was to develop that reporting checklist. And just to be clear, it wasn't about how to do a DCE or even to produce a score of reporting quality, though that's something we are considering doing now. We think that it's probably most relevant to DCEs, but there are other types of choice-based preference studies that some of the elements of this reporting checklist could be useful for, such as best worst scaling studies. And we intended it for the health literature, but it's not impossible that somebody working in another literature might find this helpful as well. In terms of the methods we used to develop the reporting checklist, we had a series of methods. So we started with a scoping review where we looked at papers that had been some of those guideline papers on methods, or checklists from other areas, the quality checklists. So there was 25 of those papers from which we identified 313 potential items. We narrowed that down to 162 by removing duplicates, and then we narrowed that down further to 48 potential items by excluding things that were really clearly about quality rather than reporting, telling someone how to do a study rather than asking them what they'd done, or were things that were very specific to certain types of studies and wouldn't be generally appropriate to most DCEs. So then we took those 48 items to an online Delphi consensus study among a group of international experts in DCEs who we identified through their publication records and their standing in terms of expertise on certain groups. And we did this at the end of 2023. And what we found was, so we had 48 items and we had some criteria that we specified a priori, and they were about, the first criteria was about an item being rated highly and not being rated lowly. And then separately from that, on Likert scales, and then separately from that, we asked people which were their top 10 priority items for inclusion. And so there was a criterion about it being in 15% or more of those people had nominated that. So we found that 7 items could be dropped because they met neither of those criteria. 23 items met both criteria, and we thought that that was hard, and that meant that they were priorities to include. And then there was a further 16 items that were only met criterion 1 and not criterion 2. There was also an extra item that was added because a sufficient number of people suggested it, which was related to the software used for analysis. And we did some rewording as well. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this was the items that were dropped after round 1. And I just wanted to mention that one of these is one of my favourites, which is reporting the attributes that you've considered but excluded for different reasons. And I do think that's really helpful information to know, because often you come to read a DCE and you think, oh, but they should have included blah, blah. And then if there's a good reason why that's not the case, it's kind of helpful to report it. But anyway, so these are still, I think, useful. They're just not core to the checklist. So then we took the remaining items to round 2 of the Delphi. And they were the same people who'd completed round 1. And for this part of the Delphi, we actually used a choice-based reference study. We used a best-worst scaling study, which was fit for purpose for selecting items for priority. So what that involved was a series of these kinds of choice sets where you're asked to nominate which of these 6 items was the most important to include and which one was the least important to include, and then you repeat and end up with a series of choices from everybody in the study. So we used a 16-item balanced incomplete block design with 6 items per task, and people were randomised in a few ways. And we analysed the results in terms of the number of times an item was reported as best or worst, then the individual best-worst scores, which is the number of times it's scored as best minus the number of times it's scored as worst at both the individual and aggregate level. And we also ran a multinomial logit model for the choice of best or choice of worst. And we also asked people to tell us if an item should be added, even though it made the checklist longer, because we were really asking people to think about kind of the length of the checklist rather than being able to include everything. So these are our results. And so you can see we've kind of got various things that we were balancing off against one another in terms of, well, what do we think we should do and how are these helping to inform our prioritisation? There was a few items that the things that are bold and italicised were the things that were the top 5 items in each of these lists for inclusion. So things that are the most number of best, the lowest number of worst, and that's reflected in these scores. I'm going to show you a different figure next, which shows you those individual best-worst scores along the bottom, but also some measure of the kind of amount of uncertainty there was around that, or the amount of variation. And so our top 5 kind of ranked items on the different lists were these ones. They're kind of similar in magnitude on the individual best-worst scores, but these 2 up here had quite a bit more variation around them than these ones. And so that helped us to inform our selection. I also think it's worth noting that the item which quite a number of people thought was worth including by suggesting it as an item we should add, and if we go back here, quite a lot of people said that it should be added, even though it made the checklist longer. But when we looked at their other results, when they were asked to trade off against the other attributes, it didn't actually come out as a very high priority. It had a low best-worst score and had quite a high degree of variation around that response. So some people really liked it and some people didn't. So we didn't achieve consensus on that one. So what we found after that process was that if I go back to this circle diagram, not enough people selected any of these to be dropped, so they were all able to be included. We also asked people how they felt about having a longer checklist than those 23 items, and a majority of people were fine with that. Well, we added those top 3 items that were down here in this bottom corner, but we were also able to include the next couple of high priority items by combining them with existing items in the checklist in a meaningful way, we thought. So we ended up with 26 checklist items. We then took that to a piloting process where we asked a community of DCE practice that I was part of, who was mostly very inexperienced DCE practitioners, to use the checklist to review the reporting of a paper that either they'd written or they were reading, and tell us about their experiences using it. And so as a result of that, we found some minor edits to be done to the wording, and also really emphasised the importance of describing how to use the checklist and each item. So we ended up including both a description of the items overall in the paper, but then in the appendix to the paper, we included an item by item delineation and including examples of where they had been successfully included in a paper. So I'm just going to talk through the checklist that we landed on, so that you get some idea of what's included and what it is. I guess this is the kinds of things that we want to know when we read a DCE. So the first couple, I think, probably are a bit strange to newcomers to DCEs, that this is often discussed. In fact, I've reported these items subsequently in a paper and had a reviewer say, I don't think you need to tell us all this. So that's an interesting one, but often it's asked for by people who are reviewing DCE papers. So that's setting the scene of the DCE and why the DCE is a useful tool to use to answer the research question. Why aren't you using, for instance, revealed preference data, or why preferences are relevant to the analysis? You know, how will that answer the research question? How will the results be useful to inform something like decision making? But also really understanding what it is that the DCE is feeding into. What's the real world situation, which helps us then understand later in the rest of the paper how do you interpret things like the sample selection process to represent the target or target population that you're really trying to represent the preferences of. The next domain in the checklist looks at the attributes and levels, and it's focusing on how they were derived and what the final list was. So the process of how attributes and levels are derived is a very big field and can involve publishing a whole separate paper. For instance, if you conduct a formal literature review or do qualitative methods that you write up separately. So that might be what you do to develop the attributes and levels, but it might be a much simpler fit for purpose approach. So this doesn't sort of specify that you should use one or more of these methods. For instance, I was just talking to people today about the use of a market scan to find out about levels that are in the real world. Obviously, that's not going to be appropriate for something where you're using a DCE to value quality of life. There's no such thing as a market. So it's not about defining what should be used, but just making clear what was done so that the reader can work out if they think you've done a good job, which I guess is the whole point of a reporting checklist. We had a lot of to and fro with the Delphi participants about, what needs to be included in the paper, what can be included in supplementary material. We don't specify that as a rule in the checklist, but the issue of including the list of attributes and levels in the main paper and not just in the supplementary material was felt to be pretty important by the Delphi participants, because it really helps the reader to understand what you've done and interpret all the things that they're seeing as results. It could be partially helped also by the inclusion of a sample choice set, which was another high priority for inclusion in the main paper in the Delphi study. And the sample choice set actually ticks off heaps of items in the checklist for things like the response options and whether or not it's a labelled choice experiment, the number of attributes, and so on. So those will be two big things to include in the main paper, I'd say: a list of attributes and levels and a sample choice set. Regarding the experimental design, now our participants were DCE experts. They're pretty keen on experimental design as a focus, and it's understandable when The experimental design is kind of how DCEs fail or not, and they're in the control of the person conducting the DCE. So really it is, and the onus is on us to get that right. And it's important for the reader to be able to understand what you've done and not to just fudge the reporting, so that they can tell, for instance, what kind of experimental design you used and how does that relate to the results that you're reporting to me. So for instance, I've had the experience as a reviewer when I'm told that they include X interactions, for instance, in the model results, but they didn't tell me up front if their experimental design included those interaction terms, and it was a smallish study size. And so I felt like maybe that's a problem, that they're forcing these into their model when they didn't include them in their design. You might not have that same concern if you knew that the design included the interactions. So there's quite a lot of just specifying. As I said, a lot of these are quite easy to tick off with just a few words in the paper or even a figure. And I will flag that we're not suggesting that people have to be reporting code of their experimental design, although that's always welcome in a supplementary material, or equations or anything like that. That's often not appropriate for the journal audience. Excuse me. Then there was a number of items related to survey design, and that included a couple of the ones that we added post the Best Worth scaling study about piloting. And I would say that I think that that's fit for purpose in how the literature is moving increasingly towards scrutiny on how you get from your selection of attributes and levels, how you work them out, get narrowed down to a set that you're going to include, and then how you actually implement that in a survey and test it with potential participants or people with lived experience or a range of other people. And, you know, are you going to use figures? Are you going to use those? How are you going to depict risk? How are you going to depict proportions? How are you going to cope with the fact that you've got a complex choice for people to make with a lot of information? Are you going to use avatars to help people work through the text that's in the survey? So all of those things are really important, but it's not prescriptive as to which you should use. It's just important that the reader understands what was done, because it's such an important area for the quality of the study and making sure that it does what it wants to do. So sometimes we wanted out to people to report whether or not something was done, and that an example is randomisation, which is a bit of a vexed issue in the DCE sort of community. Some people feel like randomisation, some kinds of randomisation can make it more difficult. For instance, if you randomise the attribute order within and the choice sets that one individual sees, that means each time they look at a choice set, they have to look at a different ordering versus randomising the order between individuals. So making that kind of thing clear, it helps the reader to understand the impact on the results. Then there's some items that relate to the sample and data collection. Obviously, for any study, inclusion and exclusion criteria are really helpful to understand who the sample are and whether the reader thinks they represent the correct population. There's, I think, probably a trend towards asking for response rate type information in reporting DCEs. So that can be a bit tricky. Often if, say, an invite is seen by an unknown number of people, but you can usually report something around, for instance, a proportion of people who start the survey or click the link to complete, and so on. We have a lot of discussion in publishing DCEs papers about sample size and whether calculations are required. So this is not asking for sample size calculations, but just to report something about how the sample size was determined, which might be the use of a range of common rules of thumb, but just reporting that is helpful. And, you know, we mentioned in the paper that sometimes it's a really small sample, but for instance, if you've sampled all of the HTA policy sphere in Australia, that's probably not going to be a very big potential sample. And so your smallish sample might represent a large proportion of the population. Representativeness is a tricky one. A number of the Delphi respondents talked about the fact that we ask often about things like attitudes and beliefs and experiences to help us understand heterogeneity of choices, and we wouldn't often have any idea whether how they compared to the target population as a whole, because they're often not known. So the expectation is not that we would be able to discuss representativeness against all of our descriptive characteristics, but just to have some idea of how they relate to the target population. Another really big issue in DCEs, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon, is the presence of fraudulent or bot type respondents, particularly, well, I mean, almost always when in online surveys and when they're incentivized with some kind of financial incentive. So we have a lot of ways that we're trying to use to avoid those, to detect those, and that can be at the design stage, but also at the analysis stage. Here, the main issue is reporting what you've done and whether you've removed anybody. So that's often a response to this kind of detection of bots and so on, is you say, all right, we removed everybody who was a bot. But it can also mean things like, well, there was a setting of a level of people going through the survey too fast, so speeders are dropped, but that might mean that you're dropping people who just happen to be really fast readers, or are very clear about their preferences, and so find it easier than everybody else to make their choices. So there's a bit of, I guess, disagreement about what the appropriate way to respond to those kind of participants in the survey are. So reporting what you've done and if you've dropped anybody is really important. Again, we wouldn't say that it's necessary in every paper to use equations, but it's important that the reader can understand what the model specification was. For instance, sometimes we see just a subset of the results presented, or just the main effects, even though there are interactions or non-linearities, for instance, in the model, and that's sort of buried somewhere in the background and you can't tell what's going on. I've definitely seen papers like that, so we think that it's important that it's clear, and so did the Delphi participants. In terms of reporting, so there's a lot of different approaches to reporting the results and the outputs, and what kind of post-estimation analysis is used. And there's, for anyone, like for instance with willingness to pay, there are quite different approaches to estimating willingness to pay. It can be a simple marginal rate of substitution. It can be something more complicated, and it's important that that's described, and also that those kind of outputs have an estimate of uncertainty around them reported. So that's the checklist. My reflections to that work it was really interesting as an approach to thinking about consensus, as well as understanding priority. We enjoyed the use of the best first scaling study in combination with the Delphi and free text and qualitative responses. Sounded quite informative, and we feel that the checklist has landed at a good place that seems to make sense to a lot of people. There's quite a lot of variation in the DCE community about how prescriptive we should be about what's right, like what's a good enough quality of the work, and that's reflected a bit in how people think that what should go into the checklist and how long it should be. There's quite a lot of variation in practice around what kinds of analysis are done and therefore what's reported. And so people, I guess, who work in one field, I think an obvious one for me is that there's quite different methods often used in quality of life type DCEs than in preferences for goods and services type DCEs. And so the expectations of people working in those different fields will be quite different coming to that. But I think that getting some closer to common practice of reporting helps us to understand what each other are doing. As I already mentioned, the issue around representativeness, and I think that the one of the big key points was include a sample choice set, include the final list of attributes and levels. That will get you a long way towards people feeling like I can understand what you've done. And as I said in the paper, there's this item by item description and also kind of a narrative, a bit like what I've talked you through today. So far, I mean, it's only been 6 months or so that the paper's been in the world. So far, it's included in some journal submission guidelines like pharmacoeconomics and the patient and a few others. And we've also noticed that it's being used in clinical journals. I think that's because often people are asked to submit the appropriate reporting checklist, and there used not to be one. And so now I think people have got something that they can include when that's asked. We haven't seen anybody kind of ticking the items or listing them in the page numbers. They're more just saying reported according to the checklist. So we'll see how that goes. Either is fine as far as I'm concerned. We do have plans to develop a scoring instrument. That would be more for the use of people conducting systematic reviews of DCEs, to be able to score reporting quality as part of that. We did note the possibility that it might be necessary to add some bolt-ons for specific applications. I don't know if there's something to do with working alongside trials. I'm just doing my first DCE alongside or embedded within a clinical trial at the moment, which is a really interesting experience and an interesting application. And we'll be looking out for future systematic reviews to see if reporting quality improves over time with the use of the checklist. And that's the end of my presentation. I might unshare my screen so I can see you all.
Thanks so much, Jemima. Fantastic. I just didn't know if it was said or was captured or not, but were there any of the societies involved in the developing or supporting the kind of development of the checklist?
So yeah, that was one of the interesting differences in approach to developing consensus. Often in DCEs especially, it comes under the banner of one of the big organisations like ISPOR. In this case, no, it was us doing it on our own, and I think that got a few people offside, actually, that they felt like it should have been the big group coming up with the ideas and having it under their auspices. So I'm not sure how that's landed now that we've finished the work. Haven't heard anybody tell me.
So
should I be looking at the Q&A?
Yeah, I'm just opening that up now. It's just kind of circle of death on my screen. So I'll take the opportunity. Oh, here we go. Will the recording be made available? I might ask.
Yes, it will be available on the ACTA website.
Perfect. Thanks, Natalie. I guess one other question, I guess, in thinking about even cost effectiveness analyses, you got the kind of CHEERS reporting checklist. And then you kind of see a few kind of developments and movements, and I know there's a new one looking at trying to kind of assess the quality. So not just was it reported, but actually was it conducted well? And obviously there's guidelines and other sort of papers that have kind of touched on the issues of quality of discrete choice experiments. Is there any interest to kind of formalize, quality as opposed to just was it reported, and if it was reported, importance of reporting it versus the actual quality in undertaking it?
So I think there's two potentially useful quality type checklists that people sometimes use. Commonly people use the PREFS checklist, which is a quality checklist for DCEs. I think even the authors of that study though say that they are planning to further develop that piece so that it's more comprehensive. And I think there's so many different perspectives on what makes a good quality DCE. I personally wouldn't want to do it. I think it would be very controversial work, and I think that's probably best left to one of the organisations to do that if it needed to be reported. As I said, I think we probably will produce a way of scoring this reporting checklist that's really about, does each item get 1 point, or is there some other kind of weighting process? Because we think that could make it a bit more useful for systematic reviews, but that would be as far as we plan to go.
I'll open up to the floor. I haven't seen anything come through, but put up your hand, raise your hand, or drop a question in the Q&A, and I know Jemima would love to hear the feedback.
I have a question to put out there as well, which you can.
Oh, wonderful! Let's do that. Yeah.
So I said at the beginning, I'm not sure why more work isn't done combining economic evaluation and DCEs apart from the use of valuation on quality of life. I'm interested to hear what people think about that. Like, would you use predicted uptake in a modelled economic evaluation, for instance? And if not, why not? I'm kind of interested to know.
Well, I do know of some work where people have tried to do kind of economic evaluation from, the extra welfarist point of view alongside then a cost-benefit analysis from a more welfarist point of view. I know Mandy's work in Scotland there has done a few things like that to kind of capture the value of those extra benefits and then put it within. And otherwise, I agree with you in terms of, especially in terms of health services, that understanding of adherence, utilization, uptake can be a key driver for your underlying economic evaluation. And I'm surprised it isn't kind of moved in. Oh, got some new posts coming in. I don't want to be taking over.
Okay. Anne, your question about representativeness. Okay, so why is representativeness contentious? I guess it's more that we proposed the item from our scoping review and so on of representativeness, and that's partly because people do get asked to report on representativeness of their sample in DCEs in different journals. But there was quite a bit of pushback from the Delphi group suggesting that it's really hard to know about the characteristics of the target group that you're looking at. And that's because we're not usually, so this is with the exception of quality of life style DCEs, when you're talking about potential users of a particular good or service, so maybe people who are thinking about having a genetic test, or people who would be eligible for a screening program, or people who are going to use a mental health service. So their characteristics of those subsamples is often really difficult to know. So then you're comparing representativeness to what? And so we would often use the sample selection approach. So the how people are invited, from what population they're invited from, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, to argue that we're getting at the right sort of people, and that's how we've achieved the right sort of sample. And we can't really tell you anything about who they would be in the general population of that group of potential service users. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. It's if you're doing a general population type DCE, for instance, evaluation of quality of life, absolutely, representativeness is easy to describe and should be included. Elaborate more on the methods about the pilot study section of the checklist. And if you're there, can you just tell me, do you mean our piloting of the checklist or about how you pilot?
About what you included the pilot of the checklist. Can you, I don't know whether you can put the slides back up. Maybe I was asleep at that point, Jemima. Hi, by the way, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
But I couldn't remember. I was like, what did she say about what you had to include about how you piloted? Because again, that depends on how you do it, who you include. Is your pilot representative, like you were just alluding to?
Yeah. So I think that the two pilot related items, one relates to whether you used the pilot results to update your experimental design. So that's often the case when people conduct a pilot because they don't know what they don't have any priors for the parameters, and that's useful for an efficient design. And then they do a pilot and then obtain priors, which they then use to get a more statistically efficient design. The other point is about what you asked people to, how you conducted your piloting. So did, for instance, you do think aloud as a method? Did you just talk to a few students who happen to be wandering around your university and ask them what they thought? And I'm not judging, we've all done that. And what did you actually amend? Because I think there's that reflects this growing interest in making sure that people can understand what we're saying in the DCE, that they have kind of common understanding of the attributes and the choice scenario, and things like using those special kinds of graphical representations of attributes or avatars and so on. Like, they seem like good ideas, but sometimes they can actually make it more difficult for people to understand or create more uncertainty around what you mean. And if you haven't done piloting to ascertain that, then, or if your piloting was fairly sketchy, then that might not be clear. And I guess I would just say, I think there was a really great paper published recently that's about piloting and pre-testing, and delineates pre-testing, which is more of that kind of stuff, from piloting, which is like running your survey and making sure it works and maybe getting it priors. And I can't remember it. It's Nora Campanor is the lead author. That was a really good paper.
Thanks.
Just got another question from Jim. Sort of, I guess, an age-old and always they're going to be there for discrete choice experiments, but just asking about anything with regards to checking the bias or the difference between stated preferences and I assume, revealed preferences, or just kind of some sort of validity testing around anything? Did it come up in the discussions at all?
Yeah, so that's a big topic, the kind of external validity in particular. And so we did again, this is about reporting rather than about telling people what they should do. So I think we tell people, the checklist asks that you tell us what you did in terms of checking those kinds of things where possible, but there's certainly no requirement that people would conduct any kind of external validity testing. And I think that a lot of the elements of the checklist are intended to allow the reader to make kind of their own judgment about the likely sources of bias. So, for instance, if you show people what your choice set looks like and you describe, if you include your full survey as an appendix, which I would recommend, then people can read what the kind of framing of the choice tasks looks like and judge for themselves whether this is likely to be a vivid and realistic real-world experience for these, representing the real world for the participants, or if it's something that introduces more hypothetical bias than was necessary for that particular context. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, or if you're talking about other things with the cheat talk and so on. If you've got any other questions, I'm happy to try and answer.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Jemima. I'm very new to all of this, and I was just doing a little bit of reading around it and seeing how important it was to include those bias checks. But it seems from what you're saying, as long as you're making it clear what you're doing, then it's kind of up to you as an author and describing what you're doing so the reader can make a decision. So that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say about most of the checklist, actually. Because I mean, something like, I don't know if I mentioned this as I spoke, randomization, I think can be really helpful, but it depends how someone uses it. If they randomize the attribute order within the person's set of choice sets, then it's going to make life more difficult. But if you randomize in a different way, it's going to make life better. So I think being clear what you do just helps people understand whether that's improved or deteriorated. Does anybody have any thoughts about my question about the use of, apart from Josh, thank you, Josh, about the use of DCEs to inform take in a model or other uses in economic evaluation? I'll live in uncertainty then.
Jemima, at the beginning you were mentioning kind of the role of DCEs in kind of PBAC and MSAC submissions. So for those closely aligned, will be better placed. And I'll keep just waffling while people think about your question, and then I expect a flurry of hands to go up for you. But just on that, the level of acceptance of discrete choice experiments in terms of that kind of very formal health technology assessment, what do you think? And obviously there's roles at various stages, like you were saying, around PICO or potentially informing sort of, some of the values in a modeled assessment. But, to what extent do you think that'll be accepted, or have you seen experience or reflecting on experiences, when has it sort of really worked and when hasn't it worked? I know some of the inhalers kind of went through and it didn't go well, but then others have gotten up. I don't know if you can talk more generally about that kind of level of acceptance in informing funding and reimbursement.
Yeah, I probably don't have the right experience for that because I'm in MSAC, not PBAC. Certainly, my feeling is that when we see the financial estimates in particular, which seem like they should matter to the whole process, is this 500,000 or 5 million? Probably should be, and we often just pick those numbers out of the air. I feel like that's what's happening in the submissions that we see, and I would feel like I certainly argue as a member of the PICO subcommittee, oh good, they've included a DCE to estimate uptake, but I don't know how it would fly. I haven't seen any.
Okay.
Can I ask a question for clarity, Jemima? I was just thinking about what your question was about DCEs and in models. So which like perspective are you meaning from? Are you meaning like, have you seen them used in MSAC, or are you meaning, because often, you know, a lot of the data that we put in the back of models is often around prevalence and incidence, right? So I'm like, how are we, like, what perspective are you coming from? Like what people would prefer from a policy perspective? Is that what you were meaning?
I guess I'm thinking about it, and I've seen this being done, but not in Australia, in published literature, that uptake of something as an intervention is an important parameter to estimate which proportion of the target population will end up with the intervention. And that could be both uptake and adherence, I guess, but DC is probably more useful for uptake. So if I've got something like a screening program, and you're modelling the economic evaluation for that, an estimate on that parameter of uptake, I think, would be really helpful. And I know there are other ways to derive that, but you know, surely a DCE is useful alongside something like expert opinion to estimate that parameter, I would have thought, given that we can produce an estimate of predicted uptake that uses the exact attributes that are being, like if you design it for the study, for the economic evaluation, that are the attributes of that, of the intervention that's being modelled.
Yeah, I wonder whether that's more about just because we haven't done it, or certainly maybe not in Australia, or it's not a common thing that we've thought about including. Maybe we just need to start doing it, right? Or at least consider, I mean, you'd have a bit more input from MSAC, whether you think that would be helpful. I know that's not payback, but still, I suppose how that would sit with policymakers and whether you think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm definitely biased in its favour, so I guess I'm not a very good judge. I think it would be really interesting to see how the full MSAC committee would consider that, or ESC, in fact.
Yeah, Josh, or others, I suppose, that are on the call, if anybody's listening.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important when you've got large fixed upfront kind of costs, right? So if you think about cost effectiveness analysis, tends to be, even a cohort kind of thing, it's a mean, but it's per person or per quality adjusted life year at the end, but it's kind of run at an individual. And so pharmaceuticals, you know, all your price is captured in your drug, right? So you don't really tend to have to worry about these things where you've got a large upfront fixed kind of cost. Whereas, like you said, for screening or a new service where you've got to put, you know, you've got to run a clinic for X number of hours, and that's going to be a cost regardless if you see 5 people that day or 50. Then that's where definitely that kind of uptake or actual utilization is going to have a key influence on your cost effectiveness. So I can definitely see where it could fit in. I guess I'm a bit more hesitant in terms of, you know, DCE, you know, what would you estimate it take you to do a good DCE, right? Yeah. 9 months, 12 months, at what cost to inform or include?
Can we do it alongside
how much?
The rest of the study?
Yeah.
I think probably the other area where I think it could be of increasing interest is when we're interested in heterogeneity of certain types within economic evaluations. And I'm particularly thinking of distributional cost effectiveness analysis, that there's it's not just the acronyms DCE and DCEA. I think they actually marry quite nicely together. And I mean, I'm going to try and do one of those combinations of DCE and DCA in the near future.
Can you also, sorry, Josh, go. I was just going to ask if you could remind me what that author was of that paper you were talking about before. Did you say Nora?
Nora Campanour, Campanour, I think. I'll tell you. Hang on,
I'll shove it in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Jemima.
It was I found it a really helpful paper for everybody.
Sorry, Jemima, you might need to put it in the Q&A. The chat is...
Yeah, I will. I'm just finding the link.
Okay, excellent. Thanks.
Might have to... I always knew I was spelling it wrong.
One other kind of question while you're just digging that up, Jemima, I was thinking is in I guess cost effectiveness is obviously a go-to tool. But if we're thinking about economic evaluation generally, I'm thinking, there's been a bit more of a push for multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA, and even sort of cost-consequence kind of informing. Have you seen much discrete choice experiment informing kind of, preference weights or weights around those kind of different attributes, or kind of what we might kind of consider in a broader decision-making kind of concept?
Yeah, I think some priority setting style, like approaches to uses of a DCE would be in that category. I think the other use is trying to understand desirability of the different kind of criteria you might use for something like MCDA, and what kinds of trade-offs people are willing to make. But I think probably not a lot is my answer. That's just, but I don't know the whole literature. When I looked at the number of papers that are out there, I don't know.
And then I guess bringing it back to the checklist, did the different types of or reasons for discrete choice experiment, do you think that was well covered in the checklist or influenced the checklist, or in terms of what items were considered, what items were weighted, the selection of experts, or do you think it's standard enough regardless of the DC? I mean, it's very much a reported checklist, but, just wondering how much that kind of influenced or thought about.
I think that the participants in the Delphi did cover the kind of broad categories of different types of DCE. I think the fact that like the vast majority of DCEs are either quality of life valuation or preferences for goods and services. There's very few, say, job choices or use in insurance or priority setting. I would say that we definitely noticed different types of respondents in the Delphi, that people were kind of coming from a specific perspective. So, for instance, one of the co-authors is someone who used to be in our team at UniMelb and then went to an industry position where they conduct DCEs for, say, drug companies as part of their market approach. And so she brought a really different perspective from the rest of us to the setting of expectations, and even just the idea that, we need to be not setting we needed to consider how high we set the bar for reporting when a company might then be discouraged from publishing, which we think is a desirable outcome for them to publish those studies, which often don't get published. But if it's going to look bad on the reporting quality, then they might not do that because they're averse to getting things critiqued for being of low reporting quality. So it was really interesting having that perspective, and I'm glad that we had her on our team. And yes, Jim, that's the paper. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I think we've got one last question. No, I'm sorry, Jemima. I felt like we've just had dominate, and hopefully people have had sort of things that were in their back of their head come to the forefront.
As I said, I feel like there's loads of people I don't know on this call, which is kind of nice to know that there's all these people out there doing interesting work.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jemima. I think it's been an absolute pleasure to hear from you, and great work. I think, especially people coming from clinical trials, I know the importance of, guidelines and checklists to be able to make sure, they're good to read up front to inform how we then do, but also then making sure how we read and be able to understand and hopefully, improve the overall quality of what's being undertaken and the understanding of it as well. Right. So, it's really well done.
And I would say feel free to get in touch if you have questions about the checklist or you have thoughts about DCEs and economic evaluation. I'm really interested to connect.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody. And thanks again for Active for sponsoring and supporting this event. All the best.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.